Representative Inman, you are recognized for 8 minutes and 11 seconds debating against the measure.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Members, we spent about 4 hours today talking about a $1.50 cigarette tax increase and pointing a lot of fingers back and forth. And in that 4 hours, I think we missed the mark. Because this debate over this budget isn't about a $1.50 cigarette tax increase, whether it passes or not. This debate over this budget should be about the people. And so I want to spend the better part of my 8 minutes talking about that. I think we all remember April 19th, 1995, which is the most tragic act of domestic terrorism in the history of our country. And on that day, as 168 of our citizens died, the people of Oklahoma rose up, and they rose towards danger to try to save lives. They didn't run away from it. The brave men and women of this community, of this state, did all they could to help people in that time of disaster. And it was on that day, or from the rubble of that building, that the phrase, the Oklahoma Standard, was born. The people of Oklahoma, our constituents, who we are at our core, is a citizenry that stands up for those who are most vulnerable. And then in May 3rd, 1999, when the tornado blew through my neighborhood and through Representative Joyner's neighborhood and Representative Banz's district, and some of you who live in Moore, when that blew through, we saw the same thing over again. We saw people run to danger. And once again, define for us what the Oklahoma Standard is. They stand up for people when they're in distress. They stand up for vulnerable folks. That's who we are as a people. And then again on May 20th of 2013, when another devastating tornado rolled through Moore, it happened once again. And the people of our state rose up and honored that title of Oklahoma Standard. And they rushed to those people in need to take care of those who are most vulnerable. That's the Oklahoma Standard. We're proud of that. We walk around, the governor talks about it in her speeches. We talk about it in our speeches about what the Oklahoma Standard really is. And sometimes we forget. We forget that we as a government, as elected officials, we're an offshoot of the people. We're a representative of the people. And because I guess we forget that, sometimes it seems that we believe as legislators that the Oklahoma Standard is what the good people of this state do outside of this building. When they stand up for the most vulnerable or those folks in need, that's the Oklahoma Standard. And when we get in here, this is just the legislature. We can have a legislative standard. And that's a shame. Because I believe the people of Oklahoma who helped define that term, Oklahoma Standard, they want to make sure that that standard applies across the board, not just in their private lives and not just when tragedy befalls our citizens, but they want to make sure that their representatives who come to this Capitol stand up and adhere and live by that same creed, that we will stand up and defend those who are most vulnerable, that the Oklahoma Standard will not only be there in public, but will be here in the legislature. But unfortunately, if you look at what's happened in the last 7 or 8, 9 years, we have created two separate sets of standards. For we have our Oklahoma Standard, and then we have our legislative standard. You see, in Oklahoma, our citizens care about public education. In the community of Jinx, when budget cuts were coming, because even though we had $100 a barrel oil, we'd cut taxes so much that we couldn't afford to fund education properly, the people in Jinx raised $1 million on their own to fund public schools, because that's the Oklahoma Standard. The legislative standard is to cut common education since 2009 by over $105 million and cut taxes in the process. You see, the Oklahoma Standard is, when you see it in the eyes of our citizenry, the eyes of our corporate citizens who do wonderful things like offer up scholarships to try to help make college more affordable. That's the Oklahoma Standard. But in the legislative standard, since 2009, we've cut higher ed by $229 million. 153 of it right now. Because that's the legislative standard, not the Oklahoma Standard. You see, in Oklahoma, the Oklahoma Standard says we're going to take care of our most vulnerable. We're going to take care of children. But unfortunately, since 2009, while those of our private citizens go out and they adopt children, they take in foster kids, they do the best they can to adhere and live by that Oklahoma Standard, the legislative standard says we cut the Commission on Children and Youth by 33%. We cut the Office of Disability Concerns by 40.5%. We cut juvenile affairs by 18%. We cut the health department by 26.7%. That's a legislative standard. Not the Oklahoma standard, but that's a legislative standard. You know, I represent a lot of people who gave up and sacrificed many, many hours and days and months and years of their lives to serve this country in the armed forces. Representative Joyner and Bands and I certainly do a Tinker Air Force Base in our backyard. And we are proud to say that we support veterans in this state. And so many of our citizens do. They will do whatever. Pay for their meal, open the door, say thank you for your service when they see them walk by. That's the Oklahoma standard. The legislative standard is to cut the Department of Veterans Affairs by 23% since 2009. At what point do those values that we say we hold dear and we support in our private lives, that uphold and honor that Oklahoma standard, at what point do those values come into this building and just slap you right in the face and say, you know what? If our citizens can do it in their private lives, we can certainly do it as their elected representatives in this life. At what point? It hasn't happened. Not at all. You see, folks, if you really do care about all those things that you've talked about, if you care about the Oklahoma standard, if you care about education, higher education, you don't make it more expensive to go to college. You don't take a budget that cut $58 million from Common Ed this year, that caused 4-day school weeks, that caused programs to shut down, and say, well, we're just going to give you that exact same amount of money again. We're not going to offer you any more help. You don't do that. It's not the Oklahoma standard. That's the legislative standard. You're going to hear, and you've heard it already, well, there's nothing else we could do. Members, it is what it is what you're going to hear. We did the best we could. But, folks, you left a lot on the table. A lot on the table. We could have accessed $80 million more in the rainy day fund to live up to that Oklahoma standard. We could have indexed the gross production tax and taken some of those $400 million in rebates and lived up to the Oklahoma standard. We could have gone after $1 billion or more in tax credits. We could have put them all on the table like we wanted to do to try to live up to that Oklahoma standard. We could have rolled back the income tax cut to live up to the Oklahoma standard. And yes, we could have raised the cigarette tax to live up to the Oklahoma standard. We also could have brought $900 million home to protect those 200,000 people without any health insurance to live up to the Oklahoma standard. Make no mistake about it. If you buy into the argument that there's nothing more than we could do, then you buy into the argument that we can have two separate standards, that we can tell our citizens to live by one set of values and we can govern by a completely different set. I don't buy that. My members don't buy that. And I believe there's enough of you over there who are willing to join us in a bipartisan effort to stand up in opposition to this budget and demand that they go back to the drawing board until this budget represents the Oklahoma standard that you and I have become so proud of. Because at this moment in time, it certainly does not. And that's why I humbly request that you vote no.